The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, better known as SNAP, has quietly become one of the most politically explosive issues heading into the 2026 midterm elections. While the program is technically funded through September 2026, Democrats believe Republicans' repeated efforts to cut, restrict, and restructure food assistance have created a powerful opening, one that directly touches the daily lives of millions of Americans struggling with rising costs, stagnant wages, and economic uncertainty. At first glance, SNAP may appear to be a settled issue. After all, following a historic lapse during a recent government shutdown, the first funding lapse in the program's history, Congress ultimately extended funding. But beneath that surface stability lies a sweeping overhaul embedded in a reconciliation package passed earlier this year by Republicans. That legislation dramatically reshapes eligibility rules, expands work requirements, tightens access, and shifts a greater share of administrative costs onto state governments. According to budget estimates, those changes are projected to reduce SNAP funding by approximately $187 billion by 2034. For Democrats, this is not merely a policy debate, it is a political battleground. A program that touches 42 million lives. SNAP currently serves more than 42 million Americans, including children, seniors, people with disabilities, veterans, and low-income working families. Economists have long described the program not only as a humanitarian safety net but also as an economic stabilizer, injecting money into local grocery stores, rural economies, and food supply chains. Because of its reach, changes to SNAP are rarely abstract. They show up at kitchen tables, food pantries, school cafeterias, and grocery checkout lines. Democratic strategists increasingly see this reality as central to their messaging strategy heading into the midterms. As long as Democrats keep their eye on the ball in terms of the important kitchen table issues that affect most Americans, I think we stand to do very well, said Mark Longabaugh, a longtime Democratic strategist and former advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders, in an interview with Notice. His assessment reflects a broader belief within Democratic circles that affordability, food security, and economic dignity remain far more salient to voters than ideological talking points. Republican reforms and their political cost. Republicans argue that the changes to SNAP are necessary reforms designed to reduce fraud, improve efficiency, and encourage workforce participation. The reconciliation package expanded work requirements for able-bodied adults, narrowed eligibility criteria, and placed more responsibility on states to administer and fund the program. Supporters of the changes insist these measures reflect common-sense reforms. Critics, however, argue they functionally reduce access to food assistance for vulnerable populations, especially in states with limited administrative capacity or fragile economies. Democrats have seized on that tension. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, DCCC, has already launched targeted digital ad campaigns in GOP-held districts with high SNAP usage. The strategy is clear: tie Republican incumbents directly to benefit reductions and frame the issue as a moral and economic failure rather than a budgetary necessity. Vulnerable House Republicans will be forced to answer for their cruel agenda, and it's why they'll lose the majority next year, said Katie Smith, a spokesperson for the DCCC, in a statement to Notice. That messaging is already appearing on the ground in competitive races across the country. Pennsylvania, a SNAP flashpoint. In Pennsylvania's 7th congressional district, a closely watched battleground currently represented by Republican Representative Ryan McKenzie, SNAP has emerged as a defining campaign issue. Democratic candidate Bob Brooks has been particularly vocal, framing the debate through personal experience rather than abstract policy language. Most Washington politicians have never had to worry about putting food on the table, Brooks said in a statement. I have. I've taken food stamps before, so I know how important SNAP is to families in need of some extra help. It's so frustrating to see Ryan McKenzie vote to gut SNAP and make life harder for families. Republicans, however, reject that characterization. A spokesperson for McKenzie, Arno Armstrong, pushed back strongly, arguing that the congressman's record reflects a commitment to working families rather than an attack on them. Congressman McKenzie has made delivering for working families his top priority, Armstrong said. He added that McKenzie's opponents rejected reforms that included work requirements for able-bodied adults and incentives for states to improve the accuracy and efficiency of SNAP distribution. The clash illustrates the broader political dilemma facing Republicans, defending policy changes that poll poorly among low- and middle-income voters while maintaining party unity around fiscal restraint. Iowa, SNAP and the Midwest economic anxiety. Similar dynamics are unfolding in Iowa, where Democrats are targeting Republican Representative Zach Nunn over his support for the reconciliation bill. Democratic leader Jennifer Confirst highlighted the long-term consequences for the state, estimating a $1 billion loss to Iowa over the next decade due to SNAP cuts embedded in the legislation. The impacts here are being felt far and wide, across the state, Confirst said. Another Democratic candidate, Sarah Trone Garriott, who works within a food pantry network, emphasized that SNAP's role extends beyond individual households. "These cuts are creating huge problems for our community," she said. SNAP has always been about helping our neighbors, but it also has an economic stimulus component. Republicans counter that the reforms protect those who truly need assistance while promoting responsibility and accountability. "None has always protected Iowans who truly rely on SNAP," said Mark Madova, a spokesperson for the congressman. "Able-bodied adults should work, study, or volunteer." He supported reforms that crack down on fraud without cutting benefits for those in need. A party divided even on the right. Despite official party messaging, Republicans are far from unified on SNAP. One of the most notable dissenters is Senator Josh Hawley, who criticized the lapse in SNAP funding during the government shutdown in unusually blunt terms. "What happened over 40-some days, where you had millions of Americans unable to eat, was morally repugnant," Hawley said. He described himself as the only Republican senator to publicly propose extending SNAP during the shutdown. Hawley's stance highlights an uncomfortable reality for GOP leadership. While fiscal conservatism plays well in some circles, the optics of food insecurity, especially during economic instability, carry political risk. Other Republicans remain unapologetic. "We made improvements," said Senator John Kennedy. "I think the American people will support what we've done." When asked whether SNAP reductions could become a liability in upcoming elections, Kennedy dismissed the idea outright. "No," he said. "And if you believe that, somebody needs to tell you that the voices in your head aren't real." Democrats see a moral and electoral imperative. Democrats argue that SNAP is not just another line item in the federal budget, it is a reflection of national priorities. Senator Ben Ray Lujan of New Mexico, the state with the highest SNAP reliance in the country, has repeatedly called for renewed funding efforts. "Restoring food programs in the United States should be a priority to Democrats and to Republicans," Lujan said. "All of our constituents are going to get hurt by this. I don't understand why it's not just being done." At the state level, Democratic governors are also pushing back against the Trump administration's approach. Recent actions by Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins, including threats to pause federal funding for states challenging federal data requests, have intensified the dispute. Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey accused the administration of politicizing hunger. The Trump administration is once again playing politics with the ability of working parents, seniors, and people with disabilities to get food, Healey said. New York officials echoed that warning, urging the administration to guarantee SNAP funding and avoid repeating the chaos seen during the shutdown. A preview of what's to come. As the 2026 midterms approach, SNAP is emerging as more than a policy issue. It is becoming a litmus test for how both parties understand economic pain, governance, and responsibility. Democrats believe they have found a message that resonates across regions and demographics. Republicans face the challenge of defending reforms that risk alienating voters who rely on assistance but do not see themselves as dependent. And as funding battles, court challenges, and state-level conflicts continue to unfold, one reality is becoming increasingly clear: the fight over SNAP is only beginning. But what happens next, inside Congress, inside state governments, and inside communities that depend on this program, may ultimately shape not just the midterms, but the broader political landscape of the years ahead. As the political fight over SNAP intensifies, the conflict has expanded far beyond Capitol Hill. What began as a legislative overhaul has now spilled into courtrooms, state governments, and administrative agencies, creating a multi-front struggle that Democrats believe could define the economic narrative of the next election cycle. At the center of this expanding battle is a fundamental disagreement over what SNAP is meant to be. Republicans increasingly frame the program as a temporary assistance tool that must be tightly controlled, while Democrats emphasize its role as a long-term stabilizer in an economy many Americans feel is no longer working for them. Legal fights over data and control. One of the most controversial developments emerged when the Department of Agriculture, under Secretary Brooke Rollins, requested access to sensitive personal data belonging to SNAP recipients in multiple states. The stated justification was to improve oversight, detect fraud, and ensure accurate distribution of benefits. Democratic-led states immediately pushed back. Several states filed legal challenges, arguing that the data request was overly broad, intrusive, and potentially violated privacy protections for millions of low-income Americans. In October, a federal court temporarily blocked the administration's request, halting the transfer of data while litigation continues. For Democrats, the issue became a powerful messaging tool. They argued that the administration was not merely reforming SNAP, but weaponizing bureaucracy against vulnerable populations, turning hunger into a political bargaining chip. This isn't about accountability, one Democratic official privately told reporters. This is about control. States caught in the middle. The reconciliation package's decision to shift more administrative costs to states has placed additional strain on already stretched budgets, particularly in rural and low-income regions. Governors and state agencies now face difficult choices: absorb the costs, reduce services, or restrict eligibility even further. In states with high SNAP reliance, the pressure is acute. New Mexico, Louisiana, Mississippi, West Virginia, and parts of the Midwest report some of the highest per capita SNAP usage in the country. State officials warn that increased administrative burdens could slow benefit approvals, increase errors, and leave families without food during critical periods. Democratic governors have been especially vocal. New York Governor Kathy Hochul's office issued a stark warning, stating that any delay or reduction in SNAP funding would force families into crisis and recreate the chaos experienced during the government shutdown. Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey echoed that sentiment, accusing the Trump administration of playing political games with food for families and children. Republicans respond that states must take responsibility for program efficiency, arguing that decentralization improves accountability. But privately, some GOP officials acknowledge concerns about backlash, especially in districts where SNAP recipients make up a significant share of the electorate. The economic context: why SNAP hits harder now. The SNAP debate is unfolding against a backdrop of persistent economic anxiety. While official metrics show modest improvements in inflation, many Americans report that groceries, rent, utilities, and healthcare remain unaffordable. Food prices, in particular, have become a flashpoint. Economists note that SNAP benefits often fail to keep pace with real-world grocery costs, meaning even minor eligibility changes can have outsized effects. For families already on the edge, losing or delaying benefits can mean skipped meals, reliance on food pantries, or choosing between groceries and rent. Democrats have leaned heavily into this reality. Campaign messaging increasingly centers on personal stories, parents stretching meals, seniors rationing food, and workers holding multiple jobs while still relying on assistance. Republicans, meanwhile, argue that expanding work requirements will strengthen the labor force and reduce dependency. Yet critics point out that many SNAP recipients already work, attend school, care for family members, or live in areas with limited job opportunities. The disconnect between policy language and lived experience has become a central tension in the debate. Internal GOP unease. While party leadership publicly supports SNAP reforms, cracks within Republican ranks continue to appear. Senator Josh Hawley's criticism of the program's lapse during the shutdown marked a rare moment of open dissent. Though he remains largely aligned with conservative economic policies, Hawley's comments reflected a growing awareness that food insecurity carries political risk. Other Republicans have privately expressed concern about optics, especially as Democrats flood social media and digital advertising with images of grocery lines, empty refrigerators, and struggling families. One GOP strategist, speaking anonymously, acknowledged that SNAP could become a sleeper issue in the midterms, one that does not dominate headlines but quietly shapes voter sentiment. Democratic strategy, keeping SNAP in the spotlight. Democratic leaders are acutely aware that attention is fleeting. To prevent SNAP from fading from public consciousness, they are employing a multi-pronged strategy. Forcing floor votes on SNAP-related measures, even when they are unlikely to pass. Amplifying court challenges to frame Republicans as obstructing food access. Targeting swing districts with localized messaging tied to SNAP usage. Linking SNAP cuts to broader affordability concerns, including housing and health care. The goal is simple: make SNAP unavoidable. Democrats believe that if voters associate Republicans with hunger, instability, and indifference, the electoral consequences could be severe, particularly among suburban voters, independents, and working-class families. Media and public perception. Media coverage has increasingly framed the SNAP debate as a moral question rather than a technical budget issue. Headlines focus on families affected by benefit changes, food pantry shortages, and the emotional toll of uncertainty. That framing favors Democrats. Republicans argue that the media ignores fraud prevention and efficiency gains, but polling suggests that compassion narratives resonate more strongly than fiscal arguments when food security is involved. Public opinion surveys show broad bipartisan support for SNAP as a concept, even among conservative voters. While opinions vary on how the program should be structured, outright reductions remain unpopular. This creates a strategic dilemma for Republicans: defend reforms without appearing callous. A political flashpoint heading into 2026. As both parties look ahead to the midterms, SNAP has evolved into more than a single issue. It has become a proxy for competing visions of governance. Democrats present SNAP as evidence of whether the government will protect people during hardship. Republicans frame it as a test of responsibility, efficiency, and economic participation. Neither side appears willing to back down. And as court cases progress, state budgets strain, and families feel the impact of policy changes, the political stakes continue to rise. The question is no longer whether SNAP will matter in 2026, but how deeply it will shape voter behavior once the consequences become impossible to ignore. As the 2026 midterms approach, the battle over SNAP is no longer confined to policy papers, committee hearings, or court filings. It is moving decisively into the lives of millions of Americans, and, with it, into the voting booth. Political strategists from both parties increasingly agree on one thing: programs that affect food security are among the most emotionally charged issues in American politics. When voters feel hunger, or fear it, ideology often gives way to instinct. And that reality is now shaping the electoral calculus on both sides. SNAP is a kitchen table issue. Democrats have deliberately framed SNAP not as a welfare program, but as a kitchen table issue, something that directly touches daily life. Campaign messaging avoids bureaucratic language and instead emphasizes lived experience, grocery receipts, empty shelves, parents skipping meals so children can eat. This framing is intentional. Polling consistently shows that while voters may disagree on taxes, immigration, or foreign policy, food security remains one of the few areas where empathy crosses partisan lines. Even voters who oppose big government often support food assistance when presented with real-world scenarios. Democratic candidates have increasingly leaned into personal testimony. Former SNAP recipients, food pantry volunteers, teachers, and nurses are being featured in campaign materials to humanize the issue. In districts where SNAP usage is high, the message is clear: a vote for cuts is a vote against your neighbors. The risk for Republicans. Republican leadership argues that the changes to SNAP are necessary reforms, not cuts. They emphasize work requirements, fraud prevention, and efficiency. On paper, the argument is coherent. Politically, however, it carries risk. Once benefits are reduced, delayed, or denied, explanations often matter less than outcomes. Voters may not remember legislative language, but they remember empty refrigerators and missed meals. Several GOP strategists have privately acknowledged concern that SNAP could become what healthcare was in past cycles, an issue that quietly reshapes elections district by district. Unlike tax policy, SNAP affects voters immediately. There is no delayed impact. No abstract future consequence. The effects are felt at grocery stores, food banks, and family dinner tables. Rural and suburban impact. One of the most underestimated dynamics in the SNAP debate is its geographic reach. SNAP usage is not limited to urban centers. Rural America, often portrayed as solidly Republican, relies heavily on food assistance. Agricultural regions, areas with aging populations, and counties with limited job markets report high participation rates. Suburban districts, meanwhile, are seeing increased SNAP enrollment as housing costs rise and wages struggle to keep pace with inflation. These are precisely the districts that tend to decide midterm elections. Democrats see an opportunity to fracture Republican coalitions by highlighting how SNAP cuts disproportionately affect communities that traditionally vote red. Republicans, in turn, must balance ideological consistency with electoral reality. SNAP and the broader affordability narrative. SNAP does not exist in isolation. Democrats are deliberately tying the program to a larger affordability narrative, one that includes housing, healthcare, childcare, and energy costs. The message is simple: if families cannot afford food, something is fundamentally broken. By positioning SNAP as a safety net under strain, Democrats argue that Republican economic policies favor corporations over working families. Republicans counter that affordability improves through job growth and fiscal discipline, not expanded assistance. Yet critics point out that even full-time workers increasingly rely on SNAP, undermining the narrative that employment alone guarantees stability. This tension has become one of the defining contradictions of the current economic debate. The moral dimension. Beyond strategy and statistics lies a deeper question, one that resonates strongly with voters: should access to food ever be a political bargaining chip? Faith leaders, non-profit organizations, and community groups have begun weighing in more forcefully. Food banks report rising demand. Churches and charities warn that private aid cannot replace federal programs. When SNAP faced its brief funding lapse during the shutdown, images of empty shelves and overwhelmed food pantries spread quickly online. Those images linger. Democrats have used them to argue that policy decisions have moral consequences. Republicans respond that compassion must be paired with responsibility, but the moral framing often favors those arguing against cuts. The Trump factor. President Donald Trump's role in the SNAP debate looms large. His administration opposed using contingency funds to maintain benefits during the shutdown and supported the reconciliation package's reforms. While Trump himself rarely speaks about SNAP directly, his policies have tied him to the program's changes. Democrats are eager to make that connection explicit. Campaign ads increasingly link SNAP reductions to Trump-era priorities, portraying the former president as disconnected from everyday struggles. Whether that framing resonates remains to be seen, but strategists believe it reinforces existing perceptions among swing voters. Republicans argue that Trump's broader economic record will outweigh concerns about SNAP. Yet even allies concede that food assistance is an area where messaging missteps can be costly. What happens next? With SNAP funded through September 2026, the immediate threat of expiration has passed, but the political battle is just beginning. Court cases over data access remain unresolved. States continue to grapple with administrative costs. Families adjust to new eligibility rules. And both parties refine their messaging ahead of an election that could hinge on turnout in SNAP-heavy districts. Democrats believe that sustained focus will pay dividends. Republicans believe voters will prioritize other issues. But history suggests that when people feel economic pressure in their most basic needs, they remember who they believe caused it and who promised relief. A defining test. The SNAP fight has become a defining test of political priorities. It asks voters to consider not just budgets or ideology, but values. Not just efficiency, but empathy. Not just reform, but consequence. As the midterms draw closer, one reality is becoming increasingly clear. Food insecurity is no longer a background issue. It is a political force. And in 2026, it may help decide who holds power in Washington.